Coming to you on a Tuesday afternoon. We're re-recording the sermon from Sunday, May the 5th. We had some technical difficulties with the live stream, and so we are recording this in order to post it on the website. So if you're wondering why I'm in a t-shirt and so forth, that's the reason. Now, we started a new series last week entitled Better Together. I'll admit that last week's message was a bit heavy, and we also ran a little short of time because we took in a lot of new members, and I want to spend a great deal of opportunity. I want to take the opportunity to share a little bit with the congregation about each of the individuals who are joining the church. So I was a little bit hurried and had to skip a few things, but I think I got across the main message, and what I wanted everyone to see was simply that the Godhead, three persons, and one God work in concert. And God is the poster child, you might say, for community. So I wanted us to see that by being made in God's image, we are designed to be in community. Now last week I used a character played by Tom Hanks as an illustration of how we have a deep-seated need for relationships and for community. In the movie Castaway, he plays the role of an individual who is an executive for kind of a UPS kind of operation. And the plane goes down. He's hopped the ride, and a plane goes down. And with it, all of the cargo. He's the only one to survive. And one of the pieces of cargo that washes up on a deserted island with him is a volleyball. It's made by the company Wilson. And so he names the volleyball Wilson, and he actually sketches on the volleyball. And Wilson becomes his companion that he can talk to and that he can relate with. So much does he get attached to this volleyball that when Wilson, the volleyball, washes over the side of his makeshift raft, upon his desperate attempt to escape the island and to take the risk of being rescued, he grieves as if Wilson is a human being. Really illustrates our deep-seated need for relationship. So the truth is, fellowship and belonging, friendship and relationships, community is so important to us. It's so healthy for us, so vital to our life that Aristotle said this: without friendship, no one would choose to live, even if they had all other good things in life. So you see, as creatures or the created humanity made in the image of God, community is in our DNA, it's in our makeup, it's in our nature. And regardless of how introverted we are, we long for and we need community to thrive. Now, what's interesting is that we experience tension between what we know to be our deep-seated need, that is relationships, and our own selfishness. In other words, the relationship part can be taxing because it requires us to give of ourselves. Yet we need relationships. This is why Jesus taught what he taught. Jesus taught us to love God and to love others. In fact, Jesus taught us to put God and others first. That's always the way that you will begin a relationship. It's always the way that you will keep a relationship. It's always the way that you will nurture a relationship and grow a relationship. And it's why the Apostle Paul correctly defined the approach to the fulfillment of the Christian life this way: do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, rather in humility value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others. You see, Paul recognized the tension between our need of relationship and our selfish desire to keep to ourselves. He recognized the tension that God's love demands and the selfish nature that wants to put us first. He's taking his cues from Jesus, who knew that we will never be whole, never be complete, never be happy unless we resolve that tension and we embrace what we need: fellowship, friendship, relationship, community. And at the core of faith in Jesus is community. God knows that you and I are better together. That's the way that he made us. Now this morning I want to look at another fact of our life and why it is that community is so important. It's a part of life that each of us experience. No one escapes it. And it's part of life. It's part of our life that can only be fixed, if you will, by God and others. In fact, only community can really help us here. And here's what I know. Every one of us has hurts in their life. Every one of us have had failures in life. Every one of us have had wounds and regrets and rejections. Everyone, in one sense or another, is like the key figure in an event that happened in Jesus' life and in Jesus' ministry. And it's a paralyzed man who spent his entire life on a mat. That mat sums up his entire existence. And for many of us, that mat can sum up our existence. The mat influences our life every single day. And that mat can become the definition of who we are, how we relate to others, even how we see God. And his friends and Jesus changed his relationship to that mat. So let's go straight to the story. We find it in Mark's record of Jesus' life. And so we're going to turn right to it. This is how Mark begins to record this event. A few days later, when Jesus again entered Capernaum. Now, Capernaum was in Galilee, and all of Jesus' disciples came from the Galilean area, with the exception of Judas Iscariot, who came from Judea in that area. It was a fishing village, and it was kind of the headquarters for Jesus' ministry. Now, continuing on, Mark writes, the people heard that he had come home. They gathered in such large numbers that there was no room left, not even outside the door, and he preached the word to them. So Jesus comes back to Capernaum, and he goes to a house in Capernaum, and the crowds follow him in. In fact, we know from the other gospel events, or the other gospel records, I should say, that a lot of the leaders, the religious leaders from all over the area, from Jerusalem and Judea, as well as Galilee, all had filed in to Capernaum because they knew Jesus was there to listen to him. And so if you can picture this house, it is filled to the brim. People are sitting in front of Jesus, right up against him as he's getting ready to teach. There's people that are looking in the windows on the outside because they can't get inside. People at the door that are maybe 3, 4, 5, 6 people deep that have just got their ear turned in so that they might hear the words of Jesus. Now we come to the key and significant verse. Here's what he says. Some men came, bringing to him a paralyzed man carried by 4 of them. Now, I want to take a moment and make 2 observations from Mark's record here. First, there were more than 4 men that were interested and had a heart for this paralyzed man. More than 4 that were involved in the life of this paralyzed man. Mark's record says some men came, and at the end says carried by 4 of them. And the key word here is them. It implies that more than 4 men had the paralyzed man in mind, and it implies that all of them had one thing in mind, and that was to help their friend. Now, I dare say that the majority of us have people in our lives that, when pressed, care about us. The question becomes, do we let people in our life care about us? And do we take time to enter into the lives of those around us that we care about? The point is that you and I probably have a larger community than we often realize. So people who often feel alone, people who feel alone and feel isolated, feel that way most often because they choose to be alone and choose to be isolated. Often when we are hurt or rejected, we choose to hibernate to protect ourselves from further harm. What we don't realize is that we harm ourselves further by withdrawing from people rather than risking vulnerability. Now, the second observation I want to make is that we all have people who will bear our weight if we will let them. You see, 4 of that group, 4 of his friends were willing to literally carry him to Jesus. They were invested in taking him to see Jesus and would not be dissuaded for any reason. Again, when we have probably a larger community of weight-bearing friends than we often realize. These are friends who we can lean in on. They're friends who we can count on. They are people who will listen to us and love us regardless of our failures. They are more interested in our well-being than they are their own well-being. And they're more interested in us than what we've done good or what we've done bad. So Mark continues. Since they could not get him to Jesus because of the crowd, they made an opening in the roof above Jesus by digging through it and then lowered the mat the man was lying on. Now there's a lot here. So let's look at the man, and then we'll look at the extent that his friends, his weight-bearing friends, went to for him. Okay? First, as we've mentioned, everybody has a mat. You and I have a mat. Let's let that mat stand as a picture of human brokenness and imperfection. And I'm tempted to say that the mat represents what's not normal about you and me. But the truth is, I'm reminded of the greatest title of a book that I've ever seen. In fact, I think the title was better than the book, and the book was good. It was written by John Ortberg, and the title was "Everybody's Normal Till You Get to Know Them." So let's be honest from the start. What is normal about you and me is that we are all broken in various degrees. And what is abnormal in life is perfection. And I have never met Mr. or Mrs. Perfection, and I doubt that you've ever met Mr. or Mrs. Perfection. You see, if we are not broken, then we have no need of Jesus. So our mats all have a little tag attached to them that says, "as is." Now, I'm into cars. I like cars, like going to auctions, and even checking out car lots from time to time. And sometimes you come across a car, and you kind of like the looks of it, and you look on the windshield and put on there, it says, "as is." That means it has no warranty. So if something goes wrong once you purchase it, it's on you. Nobody else is going to fix it. It means that whatever problem there is, it's your problem. It's as is. And so we all have a little tag on our mat that says, "as is." And what we usually do is we like to hide our as is tag. We don't want anybody to see the issues that we have. We really don't want them to see what's behind our mat, so to speak. But it's only when we allow others to see our mat that we realize that the people we are hiding our mat from have mats too. And all of their mats have tags that say, "as is." And it is admitting that we have a mat and in revealing our mat that possible help and healing can come. And this is the genius of God. God knows that when we work in concert together, we give help and receive help from each other, and healing becomes possible. So you could say that wherever human beings love and human beings accept and serve one another, in the face of weakness and in the face of need, there is what we might call a fellowship of the mat. Now, for the fellow in our story, the mat represented several things. First, it represented the 3x6 space that he occupied and could not escape from. It also represented the judgment placed upon him by others as having done something bad enough to deserve the curse of that mat. It also represented this, the absolute dependency upon the pity of others just to survive. Also, the fact that his entire world was controlled by that 3x6 prison, the mat. And finally, the fact that the mat was the definition of his life. He was defined by the mat. Now, I believe that most of us today spend our lives doing mat management and doing it rather poorly. We pretend to not have a mat so that others see us as healthy and strong and having it all together. We want to present ourselves as having it together and in control and on top of things. And the truth is that God created us in such a way that we need mat communities. And the only way to be healthy is to share our our mats and have others share their mats with us in our lives. And the only way to find healthiness is to accept one another with our mats in tow, with the little tags that say, as is. And help each other to seek Jesus, who is the only one who can set us free from the control of our mats. In fact, he uses people who find him and his ability to free them from the control of their mats to bring us to him with our own mats. So let's go back and let's look again at verse 4. Mark records, since they could not get him to Jesus because of the crowd, they made an opening in the roof above Jesus by digging through it and then lowered the mat the man was lying on. You see, we need friends who will bear our weight, and we need friends who you might say are roof crashers, okay? These fellows had friends that bore his weight and carried his mat, and friends who were willing to dig through the obstacles. And we all present obstacles with our mats, to dig through the obstacles to get to the healing. They heard about Jesus, and their thought was not themselves, but it was their friend. Now, we use the term friend today pretty loosely. In fact, with the advent of social media, the term friend has taken on all kinds of new meaning. In the social media world, we can friend someone we hardly know, or we simply don't know at all. We friend them because they've friended us, because they know a friend of us that's on social media, and therefore we end up friending someone or accepting a friendship from someone that we've never met before, and we absolutely know nothing about them. And the bottom line is, what we really have are a lot of acquaintances and few friends, people who really know us inside and out. But roof crashers are those kinds of true friends who know us inside and out. They know our mats and they know our tag that says as is. Friends will be inconvenienced. Friends will think of you before they think of themselves. In fact, believer friends will think of a way to get you to Jesus. They won't define you by your sin or your mat or your as is tag. They won't consider you too far gone or a lost cause. They will see you just as they saw themselves, someone who needs others, and most importantly, someone who needs Jesus. These fellows carried their friend to the house where Jesus was speaking, and they didn't get there early enough to get inside to the front row. They didn't get there early enough to get inside to the back row. They didn't even get there early enough to get close to the door or close to the window. So no obstacle was going to stop them. They climb on the roof. They lift their friend up by the mat onto the roof. They dig through the roof. Then they lower their friend on his mat, and they put him right at the feet of Jesus. You see, being a friend is messy. People are messy. In fact, I'm messy. My wife Lois, when we got married, she repeated something that everybody who's gotten married and have said in these vows. They've exchanged these vows. And in that, she said, for better, for worse. If you're married, like I said, you did so as well. It's like saying, I accept you, I accept your mat, I'm going to love you anyway. I'll stay with you in spite of your mat. I'll stay with you in spite of your as-is tag. I'll be there with you even when it's messy. Now, picture the scene, if you will. Jesus is teaching, and suddenly stuff starts floating down from above. Dust and straw particles and chunks of stuff. And Jesus is getting it, and he's probably in his hair. Those who were seated close to him up front, they're getting it in their hair. They're brushing it away, and they're all looking up to see what's going on above them. And then suddenly they see this fellow being lowered down on the mat by ropes. And when he makes it safely to the ground in front of Jesus, Jesus looks up and he sees four faces looking down through the hole in the roof, anxiously waiting on to see what Jesus is going to do. Four guys accepting their friend just as he was, judged, cursed, a beggar, but putting their friend before themselves and expecting Jesus to help their friend. I like what one author wrote. He says, community gets built by servants, great community gets built by roof crashers. And so this guy had roof crashers as great friends, and they were building great community. Now let's look at the next line recorded by Mark. When Jesus saw their faith, not the faith of the guy they put in front of him, but the faith that was in the four faces looking down through the hole. So this is important. The faith of the 4 weight-bearing friends was the thing that Jesus was focused in on. And if you're a believer, I want you to think about something. If you are a believer, the chances are that you were brought to faith in Jesus by someone who already had faith in Jesus. In fact, people of faith bring people to faith. People free from the control of their mats bring people bound to their mats to the one who can set them free from their mat. This event shows us just what the faith community is about and what faith in someone can do. It was more about the faith of the 4 friends than the faith of the man on the mat. Now let's look again at verse 5. When Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralyzed man, "Son, your sins are forgiven." Here's what I want us to know. Mat freeing is always a spiritual thing. Regardless of what your mat or mats represent, failures, attitudes, regrets, broken relationships, addiction, you name it, it's always a spiritual thing. It is either sin or it is the result of sin. And your sin always separates, our sin always separates us from God and from others. Sin is a destroyer of relationships, and sin is a destroyer of community. And Jesus is a redeemer and a reconciler of such. Now, in Jesus' day, all physical abnormality was labeled a curse of sin. It was understood as punishment from God. In fact, the Jewish people believed you could even sin in the womb of your mother. And so this guy, no doubt, has grown up believing that either his parents had sinned or his grandparents had sinned, or that he must have sinned in his mom's womb or shortly after he was born or whatever, because his condition and being stuck on this mat was a result of that sin. And it's probably one of the reasons why Jesus addresses him the way that he does, by telling him his sins are forgiven, because in his mind there's no possible way that he could ever be healed of his paralysis unless he was healed of his sin. So by Jesus forgiving him his sin, in his mind, it made it possible for him to be healed of the paralysis and set him free from his mat. In fact, as is recorded by Mark, this was what the religious leaders were thinking about when it come to this man as well. Their issue was with Jesus taking the authority to forgive the guy's sin, because they're thinking this guy is on this mat, is stuck on this mat, and deserves to be stuck on this mat, cursed of God because of his sin. And when Jesus tells him his sins are forgiven, they're thinking, who has the authority to forgive sin? Only God. So what in the world are you talking about? Now, there's one thing you and I need to know, and that's interesting, is every time that Jesus did something like this, and the religious leaders were around, and they were thinking things, Jesus always knew what they were thinking. So you shouldn't be thinking these things when you were around Jesus. Now, here's what Mark records. Now, some of the teachers of the law were sitting there thinking to themselves, why does this fellow talk like that? He's blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone? Immediately, Jesus knew in his spirit that this was what they were thinking in their hearts. And he said to them, why are you thinking these things? Which is easier, to say to this paralyzed man, your sins are forgiven, or to say, get up, take your mat and walk? But I want you to know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. So he said to the man, I tell you, get up, take your mat, and go home. He got up and he took his mat and he walked out in full view of them all. This amazed everyone, and they praised God, saying, we have never seen anything like this. Now notice something with me. The paralyzed man was told by Jesus to get up. That means leave the confines of your mat. You're no longer a slave to that mat. And then he says to him, take the mat with you. Take it with you and go on your way. You see, before he had to go where the mat took him. Before he met Jesus, he always had to be where the mat was. Now, the mat was a symbol of what he had been freed from. So he goes from being controlled by the mat to controlling the mat, so to speak. You see, we don't lose our mats. We're just freed from them. Our mats become the story of our liberty. Our mats become the testimony of the power of God. Our mats become the hope for someone else that Jesus saves, that he redeems, that he heals, that he forgives. I don't know what happened with this guy. I can only speculate. But I could see someone asking, hey, aren't you the crippled guy that used to beg on that mat at the corner of such and such a street here in Capernaum? And the fellow replies, you mean this mat? Yes, I used to be confined to this mat. But my friends took me to Jesus, and now I've been set free. See, everybody has a mat. And we all need friends who think of us first. And we all need weight-bearing friends to carry us to Jesus. And we all need Jesus to set us free from our mats. In other words, we really do need each other. Because you need me to help you with your mat, and I need you to help me with my mat. And we need to be taken to Jesus, and we need to take others to Jesus. Without his friends, this fella would have never met Jesus. And without meeting Jesus, he would have never been freed from his mat.